Is that... that's awful sideways. I feel bad now. I was all like, I'm prepared. I'm so prepared. Look at me. I'm very prepared. Let me point a webcam at my neighbor's roof.
It's an opportunity for people to come in and see what's going on.
There we go. Dear. Alright. So what I wanted to do today was just play through a little bit of supply chain. It's a project that I released yesterday. Oh, hang on. I'm not wearing my antennae. Let me fix that. There we go. That I made in collaboration with System Chalk here, who is also on Twitch. I will attempt to paste that in chat without losing my concentration. How good was that? Completely unnoticeable. So yeah, we treated this as a sort of exercise in learning some stuff about game development, and I wanted to ground that in a real world experience. And so rather than having a sort of explicitly defined teacher-student-y type relationship, I wanted to go for a more peer-style collaboration type relationship, and we started with focusing on pair programming so that we could talk through and discuss the different things that we were doing as we were approaching them, and then sort of transition more towards working in parallel independently as the projects progressed, and as you'd gotten a little bit more familiarity with what was going on. Does that sort of sum up your experience of the process?
Yeah, I mean, it's also a very diplomatic way of being able to sort of brush over the fact that right around the time I was given independence, I got a huge ramp up in terms of demands for my workplace, and so my overall level of contribution took a decided downturn. But your way of putting it is definitely makes me look a lot better.
Well, my plan always was to sort of get to a point where we could work in parallel, and not need to focus on both being available, I guess, at exactly the same time. But yeah, it was sort of fortuitous that we didn't have that kind of codependency for moving forward with the project as your availability lessened. So it's kind of positive. Yeah, it's been interesting to work on. We're gonna play a little bit first, and then we'll dig into some of the behind the scenes stuff. But I think that before we do, I just kind of want to touch on my number one main takeaway that I wanted to make sure was available as part of this experience was that making games is an iterative process where you build a foundation, which may or may not be your final foundation, and you grow and polish and tune and in part Ship of Theseus style, replace bits and pieces as you go until you arrive at whatever the final form is, which is often not visible from the start. Do you feel like that carried through a little bit at all in the experience?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I suppose the one case where I feel it maybe got a little tripped over as far as replacements, when it came down to the balance at the very end, I sort of had a very deliberate process, and then sort of at the end we changed a lot of things for release, which, I mean, this is the way life is going to be, right? Like, everything could be ideal, and it very rarely ever is.
Right.
But of course, it sort of invites the question, I always have lingering in the back of my mind as to whether or not any given change was there because I, quote unquote, had a good feeling about it, as opposed to it having sort of the same deliberative sort of justification that the others did. But to your central point about the idea of iterating and adjusting things over, I mean, that seems pretty fair. I mean, obviously, the very first thing we worked with essentially printed everything to standard output, and this has graphics. So
I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but because we started with this idea of what does this simulation look like if we just write it as a Python application without using any of Godot's APIs, without using any of Godot's you know, graphical features or anything like that. Just what if we write it as a straight command line-ish Python application? Because I felt like that would be the sort of easiest onboarding. Easiest onboarding process for you as someone who's had a little bit of experience programming, but doesn't have any familiarity with Godot. So we can sort of go, here's the simulation, we understand that, here's how we express that simulation through more domain specific tools. It was only yesterday, I think yesterday or the night before, that I removed that original simulation test that just printed things out. I felt kind of sad about getting rid of it, but I was like, it's not really related to the project anymore. Everything that's in there has been again iterated upon and changed in some fundamental ways that it's not really representative of that step anymore. And it's also called test, and it's not testing anything within the project. I was like, yeah, this is probably just going to confuse people, so I pulled it out.
It also lives in the repositories.
Yeah, it's in the history.
I want to go back. Yeah. I actually need to go for probably like 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah,
Sorry to do this to you.
No, it's totally fine.
I'll mute myself and then I'll send you a message on Discord, but it shouldn't be too long.
All right, sounds good. So another sort of very late addition was this how to play screen. Something that I felt was kind of needed from the beginning. The game itself is very minimalist, but it represents a bunch of concepts that are in real life a lot more complex, and so making sure that players understand that their only interaction is adjusting a slider, and making sure that for anybody who has questions about what is and what isn't represented within this fairly minimalist presentation, I wanted to have like just a little how to play type thing that gives a bit of background for anybody who isn't able to pick it up intuitively, and that's a nice thing to have in general. It's the same reason that there's a tutorial in Hive Time, even though originally my plan was to not have any tutorials at all. I sort of found that for people who need them, it's important that they're there. So yeah, this sort of dives down into the different elements. The only things that you can actually interact with is the resupply threshold slider here, with bounds determined by the maximum and minimum resupply boundaries here. But you look at the stock level, you look at the transit vehicles, and try and pay attention to what's going on within the simulation to react to and account for shifts and changes. We also got a few settings, like as I mentioned, we iterated on a lot of things, and as we did, and as we implemented new features, it felt like it made sense to me to make those optional, so that some of both for the purposes of us being able to test things, such as starting half stocked, makes it easier for us to test things. Auto stop production was something that we had right at the beginning, where the supply point that is producing will automatically stop once it reaches capacity, but as we worked through the game and got close to the end, we realized that allowing wastage was valuable, so we took that out, but then decided to put it back in as an option for anybody who wants to view the simulation through a different lens. Same with transit waste, and I guess events and reports, because they sort of weren't there originally either. But yeah, let's have a little go. We're starting from empty here. We probably don't have enough being created here at the manufacturer, so we're going to ramp that up to try and get a lot of stuff in our, across the entire supply chain as quickly as possible, just to sort of make sure that it's well populated. We might crank this one up as well, just to make sure we got that movement going on, and you can go up as well. And we can see, as long as this stays empty, or this, the minimum slider creeps up to sort of push demand, or to represent demand having an influence over this stuff. And the same again, as we're at capacity or full, we'll find that the top slider floats downward. And so yeah, for the first minute and a half, it's all about just sort of working out where the right thresholds for resupply are. What gets you the kind of thing that you want in order to make sure that people can still wipe their bums at home, right? So every time this shakes, it's empty. Oh, we saw some wastage here. So if a vehicle arrives and there's not enough room to store everything that they've picked up, you'll end up with some wastage. But yeah, after a minute and a half, you get the first event will fire. These are randomly selected, so you might see a couple of the same one in a row. Oh, and it looks like System Chalk is back. Welcome back.
Hello. I didn't want to come barreling in.
No, that's fine. So yeah, this is a private hoarding and resale exposed. Store stock is depleted. So this is sort of addressing this idea of the opportunistic capitalist who, during a shortage, buys up as much as they can, which inflates the impact of the shortage, and then sell at an inflated price in order to make a profit. We saw earlier this year lots of examples of things like hand sanitizer getting repossessed after people had tried to stock up like that. Welcome, Ticklish Honeybee. Yeah, we sort of wanted to make sure that everything is happening fast enough to be presenting a readable simulation, I guess. We don't have any kind of images for half-used toilet paper, so cramming all of that down so that I think the average here usage is something like what is it? Might be 1.5 to 2 rolls a week or something per person. Maybe less. Maybe about it's something around there, between 1 and 2 rolls a week, depending upon who you are, what your habits are, and how you use things. For a long time, when I was living on my own, I never bought tissues, so there's an extra piece of demand puzzle that changes things. But yeah, we saw a lot of things getting repossessed as a result of this, and obviously it must have had an impact on how available things were in stores. So obviously all of the stock that was in the store is now being consumed, and that's all gone and dealt with. And so yeah, we wanted to present. Also looks like that's reducing max storage, which I don't think that the text hints at, so we might take a bit of a look at that later on.
Which event was that?
That was the opportunistic capitalism one.
Right, I think it does. Or I don't know if you checked the event editor, but
I haven't recently, but
okay.
Yeah.
I think that one does lower the.
Yeah. I want to get into sort of like what's involved in modding and stuff in a little bit. We'll play for a couple of reports or something and see how stuff goes before we dig into that. So immediately, after, what is this, 2 minutes for the first report, I think? Mm-hmm. Feels like we've been playing a lot longer, but I've also been talking a lot, which I do. Again, thinking about iteration, I feel like this screen in particular sort of exemplifies that process. It started off with just a conversation about what sort of stuff would we like to present, and then that became some command line or output, or just giving some of these values, and then you did a quick rundown on what that might look like, and then we took that and we did some sketches based on that, and then we did some more implementation based on the sketches, and then we did some more some more polish on top of that. Seeing this screen in particular step through from being something very rough to what it is now, which is something that I really enjoy looking at, has been a lot of fun. What's your sort of feeling of the process there with this one?
This is probably one of the better examples of something where I had something that I would personally want to see in a game, but is also very clearly the sort of thing that I can't implement on my own. And so I think when you talk about the back and forth about how to achieve something like that, that's probably not a bad example of going. I mean, obviously, the version that I brought in as a sample wasn't exactly the sort of thing one might. I'm not going to put that up and share share with the family. But the final version definitely looks nice, and more importantly, there's the sort of little animation of the pages and whatnot, just little touches like that, which, if it's not conveying the information that it needs to, then that sort of stuff doesn't really matter. But I'd say, kind of as a whole, it's nice to have, and it's probably a better example of something where it's like, okay, so here's something that I would want to see if I was doing this on my own. Probably wouldn't have ever appeared. But as a result of the collaboration, it's something that I think makes the game a little more interesting and is actually present.
Yeah, I like that because initially, and we'll touch on this a bit more later as well. Initially, I just had a little sort of idea of what would the GUI look like for a small application or a small simulation that sort of touched on this stuff, and that's the sort of 4 supply points that we see in the background. But there was no like in that original concept, events weren't present. This report certainly wasn't present. All of these things were things that we stumbled upon the need for as we were developing the game. And so we're able to present some negative feedback here and say, okay, well, the time that we spend empty is important. We highlight it red and we go, okay, well, that's bad. That's something that we need to care about and think about moving forward. We've got this waste going on. We don't necessarily have a lot of understanding of what that means right now, but now that we know that those are things to look out for, we'll see them. Hopefully, we'll be able to see them and intuit what's going on in the actual gameplay. The charts were something that I was keen to have. Like, as soon as we were talking about having a report, I was like, yeah, I want to do some cool charts. This is built on the kind of concepts that the charts in Hivetime are built on, and the performance graph at the end of Honeycomb Crunch is built on. But this one actually has labels, so I'm way more proud of it. Whereas the others I'm ashamed of because they have no labels. I went through and grabbed some example color palettes out of other open source projects, and also read a bunch of research papers on colorblind palettes. And while I have questions about whether or not the orange here is super readable, this is apparently friendly to more than just my style of colorblindness, so it feels nice to have some fun colors in here as well. But yeah, so anytime a vehicle arrives at a supply point with more stock than can fit in there, we'll get some wastage. Initially we weren't going to allow vehicles to have what am I saying? To carry more than they could deliver, because that's sort of how it works in real life. You never order more than you can deliver. There you go. It was a little bit of wastage there. Oh no! So we've got production is paused here now that there's been an earthquake. But it is kind of true that things move through the supply chain with the expectation that there is already flow, and so you do have situations where you kind of order stock based on your projected sales, and if you don't make those sales, then you've got a bit of a problem, since you need to find somewhere to store all that. And so I feel like that change that we made to the transit vehicle behavior kind of reflects that concern, and also highlights that the flow of goods across the supply chain is an important part of the puzzle. So just after Peter finished doing the music for the new Hivetime trailer that I released late last month, he mentioned that he'd been furloughed. Since that has pronounced, I've never bothered to say that word out loud. But yeah, he mentioned that he'd been, um, his work opportunities had decreased, and he didn't have any stuff to go on with, and was looking for more music projects. And I was like, okay, well, doing this little mostly light-hearted toilet paper thing, and yeah, really, really, really happy with what he ended up coming up with. We'd already collaborated on Hive Time, which is kind of similar in that it's in that kind of management sim domain, but what am I saying? Yeah, with this it was a little bit less. There was less of a need to kind of ground it in any sort of stylistic concerns. Like Hive Time had a lot of particular and conscious tone decisions. Wow, really wants to give us these earthquakes.
I want to know if anybody else has had the experience you've had. I don't think I've ever seen that.
Yeah, I haven't seen that many earthquakes in a row. But if you're on a fault line, you're on a fault line, right? But I have no idea what I was saying. It's just waffling, talking garbage. But yeah, bring Peter on was really cool. I sort of said, hey, do whatever you want. My initial sort of feeling was something SimCity-ish, which was also a bit of an inspiration that we drew upon for Hive Time soundtrack. Well, let's turn that down so we don't get so much wastage. No, we won't get a truck there in time. And he came up with this cool groovy stuff that feels a little bit. In my mind, it's kind of feels like it's evoking Transport Tycoon a little bit more than SimCity. Peter isn't online, so I haven't invited him to join me, but I'm sure he'll share some thoughts when he releases the soundtrack he's planning to. It's only like 4 tracks, but yeah, it's kind of fun. This is the roadworks. This is near the warehouse, so between the manufacturer and the warehouse, vehicles are going to be moving very slow. We should dispatch one now, just to make sure that we can keep up. And each of the events only lasts for 20 seconds, which I think is long enough for you to sort of really get a handle on what's going on. Let's crank that up. But perhaps. I don't know. Maybe the roadworks one should last longer. Maybe it shouldn't. I feel like it shouldn't be too long. I feel like it shouldn't be too short. It turns out that 20 seconds feels like it's at least close to where we need things to be. So we sort of stuck there.
I mean, one of the things that's on those particular events as well, when I was sort of thinking about them, I'm perhaps not too worried about a given. I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. I'm not too worried about any individual event where, say, oh well, did this slowdown wind up depleting the warehouse? Because I actually don't necessarily think that is all that interesting. What we really tend to care about is the manufacturer and the consumer. And obviously, from our own perspective, the consumer is us, so we tend to care about that
right.
quite a bit more than anything. So what I always tend to feel about with those kinds of events are, so I mean, you said your interest was in sort of examining just-in-time supply chains. So the real thing you kind of want to be scared about is, have you built this in such a way that you are, you're leaving yourself open to these otherwise minor disruptions, and suddenly they become really big ones, or have you sort of built in enough, enough slack that you're not producing waste? Obviously, that's wrong on the other side,
right?
But are you able to weather what's going on? So. You already know that, like, my perfect supply chain from an efficiency point of view is one that has the warehouse constantly at 0. And when I was doing the balance runs without events, that was exactly how the warehouse behaved, because any amount higher or lower meant that I ultimately wasn't finding what that perfect parameter for all the other ones were. But of course, Just so you got energy drinks.
Yeah, that boosts the productivity
So
and,
you're gonna
and
be
increases potential wastage here.
yeah, and you're already at maximum.
Yeah.
Now you know why I had a whole bunch of reasons for putting that one in.
No, it's good. I really appreciate it.
But yeah, it's one of these ones where, I mean, so clearly I don't want it to be a propaganda piece for how I think supply chains should work, because I actually don't know how they should be working. But I do think probably the most interesting role for those transport events aren't necessarily the ones where, like, the first pass of balancing is, oh, this doesn't seem to be directly, influencing the supply point that was targeted. And then I was like, well, that's probably not so bad on the condition that I'm able to explain, where, I guess the better way of putting it would be, it's like, can I explain a circumstance under which it would cause that? Obviously, by the end, I was already maximizing everything to where it should be. I knew what the parameters were. But again, does that nudge happen to put you into an interesting place if you're not playing properly? Because in the end, a working supply chain shouldn't actually have major disruptions underneath the supply points.
Right.
That's kind of my view on it. Sorry, that was a really long answer to actually a very simple, simple element. But.
It's hard to say because, like, in terms of supply chains are primarily about meeting demand. If demand is consistent, then yeah, everything should be stable. If demand fluctuates, then an ideal supply chain should be able to absorb those fluctuations. So we talked about, like, the ideal warehouse being empty. If there's stable demand, then yes. If there's fluctuating demand, then having the warehouse be capable of being a buffer becomes valuable in and of itself. Too much is bad, too little is bad, but finding somewhere in the middle ends up is being pretty valuable. And when I worked in retail, I had the opportunity to observe at least a small slice of some of this stuff, and it's really interesting to watch the way that logistics moved stock between stores as well as stock between warehouses and stores. So it was possible that, if there's just too much at one store, there's been some kind of mix-up where there was expected demand that wasn't met, then we were able to shift those around the country, included with other shipments, rather than just creating new stock movement. So we were able to sort of, use the existing trip and benefit from the fuel already being used, as it were. To sort of normalize the distribution of stuff around places. So there's lots of interesting dynamics at work once you kind of get into this whole demand is fickle, unstable, and unpredictable reality that a lot of this stuff ends up operating in. All our toilet papers got confiscated. Oh, need to ramp up production here. Got mostly empty trucks cranking around. Oh, we can crank this up as well. I like that. Originally I was envisioning that all of the events would be transient and temporary, and that the simulation would return to its normal state very quickly. But we ended up with a couple of events that are permanent, like the speed limit changes. And I think they are really cool in that they highlight that there are factors and forces outside of your control and outside of this, like, broadly speaking, outside of the system, outside of the system, that can have a dramatic impact on stuff. So, a road closure doesn't sound like a big deal, but if that turns out to be the road where every truck that supplies whatever to a community or what have you. Birds are in the bird feeder, yay. If that can have an impact on how long it takes for stuff to get there, how much fuel and truck driver labor you're paying for in order to get stock from A to B, and things like speed limit changes on highways and stuff can cumulatively across all industries can end up having like a big impact, and it's kind of fun to represent that there. So we had a little bit of waste at the manufacturer, but not much. We had a lot of waste at the warehouse because all that entire stock got confiscated. Or was that at the store? Actually, that was at the store. I don't know what happened at the warehouse. Maybe there were a couple of... I had the resupply threshold too high, and a couple of vehicles arrived with more than there was room for. But yeah, other than that, kind of doing okay.
I'll also confess too, one of the things I was very pleasantly surprised by, and I mean, I was sort of hoping, but I wound up working a lot better than I was expecting. But I think one of the things that I like, because it shares a trait with a couple of other games that I enjoy, is that you can really focus a lot on optimizing, say, the manufacturer, especially if you're responding to an action. But because you're really focusing on that one thing, you neglect the other parts of the system, and as a result, then you have another panic to worry about. I think that happened with you and the manufacturer a little bit earlier. So that wasn't necessarily intended, because I mean, there's only so many levers that I have to sort of to force that, but I was kind of happy about it. And then that was sort of where that was the energy drink one was actually intended to be a negative event, because I was like, oh yeah, I've definitely like let the manufacturer stay at overproduction to deal with another crisis. But then I was like, well, there's actually some situations where this can be good too. So I was like, okay, so what are the specific things that I want to have happen as a result of this? Yeah, I believe you requested an increase in that value, so all the wastage you wound up with is your own dag fault.
Yep. And that's what it's all about, I guess. It's like saying in what ways can all of this be disrupted. Again, you sort of mentioned that the ideal situation is to have all the stock flowing at just enough to meet demand, meaning that there's no stock stored. In an ideal situation, they're just very, very tiny resting points for stock as they continue to move down the chain. But if you get to that, the more you optimize it, the more susceptible it is to disruption, which I think is sort of the core message that I had in mind way back when I sort of thought up the concept, and I'm feeling really good about how we were able to express that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is probably... I've actually heard these kinds of conversations on the news. Now, it might have just been that I was more sensitive to hearing about them because I was working on a game with you about this, but this has always been the trade-off that we face. Like, to a certain extent, we value efficiency a lot. And I mean, at the risk of going, way too far on a bunch of other... a bunch of other topics. Like, this is, ultimately kind of questions that people are asking in terms of globalization as a whole. Like, how much do you want to reach? How much do you want to benefit? I am definitely very warm towards the ideas of trade, and more than just for economic reasons. But it's also equally important, especially if you're going to be arguing for a particular position, to sort of understand the whole picture. And so in the end, you can get a lot of efficiency benefits from these sorts of things. But there is also a reason why in the real world, even our best examples of sort of peak efficiency haven't completely isolated everything down to the smallest possible component being, manipulated. Because in the end, there's real world frictions that you need to deal with, and that's sort of the same example here. When I talk about like the ideal warehouse has no stock, that is very much the sort of it's like physics textbooks and frictionless environments. Like this exists really well for the purposes of an illustration, and then you can say it's like, well, what's the point of a warehouse then? You say, because we don't live in a world where you can teleport from the manufacturer into your house, although I'm sure Amazon is working on that. But for me, like when I start from that point, then you start saying, it's like, okay, so what, what you sort of talk about here, well, what role does the warehouse have? Well, the warehouse is I mean, in and of itself, it has sort of this efficiency component. It's definitely helpful to have people in a local area who sort of understand where the demand is going to be. I mean, Coke is sold and bought back its bottlers, I think, like 3 times. There's a lot of investment bankers who've made a bunch of money doing that, and it's again entirely dealing with this. Like in some senses, Coca-Cola is perfect if it focuses on just creating these cases of, caramel colored sugary goop. Don't even worry about the water. Like, get somebody else to deal with that one. We're just in the goop business. And because I mean, it's the bottling is where you actually have to deal with fuel costs, and do you want to have glass or plastic? Well, which one's lighter? All of a sudden, you save a lot in terms of fuel costs. That's been it. But I mean, different regimes bring about different changes, and so as a result, you get weird things about the same company buying and selling its same unit, sort of depending on, I guess, the argument that Morgan Stanley or whoever does their iBanking, whatever argument they give them to move on. Maybe they just come up with an argument each time to just justify, they need their quarterly result. The investment bankers need their quarterly results, so they have 2 folders, one for bottling, one against bottling. And whenever they need to pad the numbers, they just approach the soft drink manufacturers.
Yeah, I mean,
this is totally
probably what happens.
Supply point. I'm sorry. But yeah, but it's like to bring it back to seeing as I've got us off on this tangent, to bring it back to the main point of this one. I mean, clearly you can. I think you could build a very interesting, sort of almost a vertical version of this sort of a thing, in terms of building up decisions in terms of what parts do you do in-house, which parts do you you send out for others. I mean, because this toilet paper's kind of on people's minds from what we've seen recently, but you could also say, if you turn it around, I think a lot of people are surprised to find out that, like, Samsung builds Apple's chips, and they're like, well, isn't Apple suing Samsung? It's like, they are. I'm like, well, why do they have businesses with them? It's like, because people like making money. And being able to, you could sort of imagine a version of this which doesn't have the manufacturer, the warehouse, the store. In this case, you're just sort of thinking about which parts you're taking in and which parts you're spinning out. Okay, like a sort of building tall instead of wide.
Outsourcing simulator type thing. Yeah. No, there's lots of like really. I feel like this sort of space of minimalist management simulations isn't very explored. And in terms of like something as usable as a thought tool or a thought experiment, which supply chain is. I think they can be potentially powerful. I don't know how powerful supply chain will be. There are a lot of other way more important things going on in the world right now, that I think will sort of mean that fewer people are bothering to sit and pick their noses while thinking about toilet paper. And also I think we kind of missed the sort of peak interest period of toilet paper shortage. I don't know what things are like over there in Canada, but here in Australia, or at least in Tasmania, shelves are normally stocked now.
I mean, not to sound too smug about it, but like in my own particular case, I never actually had to deal with like toilet paper shortage. That was a thing I was hearing about as opposed to actually facing any particular shortfall myself, which is not to say it wasn't happening, but it's one of these things that sort of I knew of.
I mean, it's interesting. Like, there was definitely something going on, I think. And supply chain was prompted by this question of, do the narratives that surround it reflect what's going on? And I didn't think that they did. So there was a lot of kind of, boomers are buying up all the toilet paper type narratives. And if you have awareness that the supply chains for like bulk toilet paper that workplaces and industries and public facilities and what have you use are entirely separate from the domestic supply chain, then it becomes very clear to see that if everybody is transitioning to working from home for a period, that regardless of whether anybody is panic buying, shelves are going to be empty. And the same goes for, if people aren't buying their lunch at work anymore, then people aren't, are going to need to have more food at home. And in that way, like, we talked about highly optimized supply chains being brittle and susceptible to disruption when unexpected things occur. Everybody working from home, or a larger percentage of the population working from home, represents a shift in demand. If we think about toilet paper, you spend a third of your life at work. If you increase toilet paper demand by 30%, no, of course it's not optimized for that. That doesn't. that's not how it works. A few percent here, 5% maybe, 10% maybe, but 30%? No way. And if people aren't going out to restaurants, and if people aren't going out to ice skating rinks or parks so much, then the use of public facilities is less as well, and so the demand is higher. The economical impact is interesting as well, because obviously workplaces, if they're buying from bulk suppliers, are typically going to be buying at different kinds of prices to domestic markets. So the shape of everything is really, really different. And while supply chain doesn't really touch directly on either of those points very directly, my hope is that people who are sort of receptive to the ideas are at least prompted to discover those thoughts when thinking about stuff. There's my little rant. But yeah, I just saw so many people talking about how there's no toilet paper, and it's all because some particular demographic is buying it all up. And I'm like, there's no evidence of panic buying. There's just, all I can see is evidence of people buying a reasonable amount, given the change in circumstances. And B, even if there was panic buying, like, that wouldn't be the root problem. The root problem is further up further up the supply chain than just or has an impact further up the supply chain than just whether or not people are some small group of people are panic buying. But there you go. Yeah, and I also didn't see empty shelves here. There was always at least one or two unpopular brands that were still sort of fully stocked on the shelves. So I was kind of like, that's my barometer. The moment that you can't find... was it sorbent? Sorbent was the one that people weren't buying? Yeah. The moment that there's no sorbent on the shelves, then there's problems. But until then, it's just people being picky.
Well, I mean, this again, I probably need to be a little careful in terms of how many digressions I introduce. But there is the idea of inferior goods, so like things that when incomes go up, people buy less of, and when incomes go down, people buy more of. So like spam is a good example. Some types of fish and whatnot.
Yep.
You tend to see things like Teslas and Lexuses. Or is it Lexi?
Lexi.
Yeah, you tend to see fewer of those being bought in a recession. So I mean, again, what you're describing, like that's not actually probably not a bad example of like if you want a maybe a not scientific but probably very accurate depiction about what your nation's statistical agency is going to be producing in the latest job reports. Like if you happen to notice that that brand that you're, as you said, like when should I panic? Like when I see that brand off the shelves, It's like, well, you're probably going to see a really disappointing jobs report
Yeah.
when when that's flying off the shelves.
It is like, as you say, like buying patterns change depending on context as well. But it has also been interesting while we're digressing. It's also been interesting to see shops here move toward sort of shortage-oriented policies that are about limiting purchase amounts in ways that historically might be frowned upon from a consumer rights perspective. And interesting to see, a lot of places not doing returns because they're only doing delivery type stuff, and they don't want potentially infected stock coming back into the store for circulation. Has been interesting to see, both sort of administration and governments and companies that interact with people attempt to navigate that stuff. I find that kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I know you were a little worried about some of that in terms of what that would mean for the long run. I mean, to a certain extent too. Like, this is stuff that's completely abstracted away in the in the simulation too. Right, like, you could sort of say, when you have, so like what I would sit down. I've got a perfect example here of a board game designer. That, like, they've got a really big backlog of stuff that they were making. So, like, it's called GMT Games, and like they did Kickstarter before Kickstarter was cool. Like, they did this thing called Project 500, because I mean, I'm sure, I guess it depends on the relative board gaminess of the people who normally watch you, but like, if you look, I guess these were like late 70s kind of board games, but you get these like monsters like the Campaign for North Africa, which, if you look on like Board Game Geek, has a playtime of 3,600 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's like, it's just this mega like thing that clearly nobody is ever actually supposed to play this thing. Like, this is more, really well-positioned war game manufacturers just flexing. I have to assume that there's a certain degree of that. But if you think about it, like, stuff like that coming out just at the dawn of computer gaming coming out is really an indicator. Like, something like that is begging for a computer to automate most of its rule systems. But on top of that, if you have this level of hubris from certain manufacturers, you also have this really interesting problem where, like, what happens if you have a failed board game? Like, at the very least, if you don't manufacture the thing, the cardboard can be used for something else, but you've spoiled the cardboard with something that you've gotten a very definitive answer that nobody wants.
Yep.
So, like, you have absolutely no recovery once you've made all of this inventory. And again, like, you're not gonna, when you say I'm gonna publish this game, it's not like you're gonna make 10 copies and see if it works. Like, you're committing to a fairly sizable expenditure to put this out for everyone. So GMT is a modern company, and they can learn the lessons from, I guess it was like SPI or whatever, or SSI, SPI.
I'm not
anyway,
sure.
whatever
my board game literacy is very low. I'm like, I was gonna say, I'm 1000% making mostly digital things, specifically so that I don't have to worry about sunk investment in stock.
Yeah. So, like, when you take a look, I to the benefit of your chat, I am actually getting to the point on this. I just need to erect a massive scaffolding to go. But like, what they do is they do this, they do this Project 500 thing, where, in order to sort of make sure that they're not committing too much, you need one disaster to sort of sink the company. They sort of got people to pre-order this promising idea, 500 orders, and they would add it to their pipeline. Now I think the number's a bit higher because they're a bit of a bigger company.
I suspect,
but I mean, this produced
well
Twilight.
perhaps compared to the 70s, both from the perspective of technological increases in production and also from the perspective of being able to communicate directly with consumers basically instantly these days, is that print-on-demand approaches for board game distribution are probably way more viable these days, and in help avoid that kind of investment in stock. Obviously, costs are higher if you're not doing bulk, but if you're not confident about something, getting that first 500 off the ground is potentially a lot easier and a lot less risky, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, I mean, for them, I think probably the benefits of virtualization have come from the fact that they don't have a bunch of in-house designers, that, they're artists, they're designers, they're all talking to each other over the internet, which
Right.
is easy for us to take for granted now. I mean, you're in Australia. That it's the old and stale that came up because it's representing my country's paper.
I'm lingering on this one for a reason. We'll finish our digressions and we'll get back to
yeah. So I'll close it out. But yeah, where I was going with the GMT thing is just, if you think so, if you were to say, okay, let's come up with the perfect store for customers. Saying to someone, getting them excited about something that might later be canceled. And when this person orders it, we're going to make them wait months. I have actually, Imperial Struggle is now just getting shipped. And I have literally been waiting for that for at least a year. This is nothing on any, you can watch any business, oriented TED Talk. You can watch, any number of people who want to put on their New Balance shoes and jeans because they think they're Steve Jobs, talking about synergy and whatnot. Nobody is going to say make your customer wait a year for their product for it to be a good thing. I know some people say, oh, what about Tesla? I'm like, unless we talk about that.
I mean, you got to imagine that for a lot of these companies who are engaging in crowdfunding and pitching it from the perspective of allowing people to enable something to exist, that a little bit of wait represents a little bit more commitment and a little bit more personal investment when the thing comes out. So there are potentially positive psychological aspects that we can lean on from these sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a discussion to be had about that. But where I was going with it is, like, right now, because of COVID, they've had a number of things sort of backed up. It seems like a lot of those orders are coming in right now, but you can kind of consider their position as a business. Like, they've had a huge interruption in terms of their cash flow, and to my understanding, they've kept everyone on payroll. They're based in California, so there was a pretty definite, lockdown order. They couldn't have done any shipping if they wanted. So now they've got probably the largest order that they've ever had to sort of digest, because of course the printers has been working away. Right. I'm sure some small interruption, but it's pretty clear that they've got more than they can handle. Now, from their point of view, the best thing that they could do would be to charge all of those orders right away and get the cash flow back and be able to deliver everything. But the flip side to that is, potentially you've got people looking at a pretty massive bill at a time when they're not really ready to, it's like when I pre-ordered Imperial Struggle, that was a year ago, I'd gotten a new job and so on and so forth. Yeah. Obviously if I'm turning around and deciding, oh yeah, actually, I might have been waiting for Imperial Struggle for 2 years now. Anyways, doesn't matter. So yeah, that's, from a business point of view, and even from you can actually come up with a consumer argument, which is to say that, these people have been waiting long enough, and like, why did you pick that game over another one? Like, I'm willing to spend it. Can't you just send it to me? They've made a number of decisions, which are ones that you could either put as being not very good business decisions or not very good customer decisions. But in the end, like, if I want to go full capitalist on this, I would just say it's like, well, this is why we sort of have markets, and why it's probably good that California isn't in the game publisher business, because except for a couple of hiccups, I'm reasonably happy with how GMT's been able to handle it. And in the end, they've been able to get, they've been able to get board games of all things, something that admittedly is having a little bit of a renaissance, but isn't exactly the sort of business that you associate with Untold Fortunes. They've been able to do it quite well.
I mean,
but then,
for
of course,
extra
you've got
context,
the other...
the board game production company that made the Hand of Fate board game is no longer in business.
Oh, yeah, perfect example then. But I mean, then on the other hand, you can also say too, like, you know, not to sound too like it's not like I have a photo of Milton Friedman sitting by my bedside or anything like that. You also have some very reasonable cases where there were interventions, such as, you know, shutting down California to prevent the spread of a disease, because, you know, the individual behavior of people may not necessarily be in line with the overall social good. And in that particular case here, I mean, to relate it to the supply points and all of that, a lot of that stuff tends to be abstracted away, in my view, to things such as waste and adjustments in terms of the minimum and maximum values. So where you say, you know, we're battening down the hatches for a big problem, yeah, you're probably going to see people's minimum refresh rates go up.
Yep.
And the consequences for that, you know, rather than be very set and say, this is the way the world works, and so, you know, we're immediately going to attack your stockpiles, we're going to say no, but we are going to say that you can't control people's intentions enough to say, you know, I'm going to do 0 refresh when there is a crisis going on. You know, your number should probably be higher rather than lower than that. And, you know, there's only so many restrictions you can put in place before people start pursuing what they look for. Anyways, yeah. I very much lost the point I was trying to make on
Apologies.
the, you know, well, it's like consumer things that are good for consumers. In some cases, like it's how narrow or you know, broad you look at. Like, you know, what's good for consumers? Every game going to $0 today,
sort of.
Right? That's a massive consumer surplus. Yeah, the sort of you're giving to that is, but then there's not going to be any game development. And you're exactly right, but that's if you go to a long term.
Yeah, it's like how big of a scope do you want to consider?
Yeah. So, anyways, I definitely monopolized quite a bit of that conversation.
No,
sorry,
fine.
chat.
It's totally fine. So I wanted to stay on this one because it does, you know, related to the topics that we're talking about. It does represent an event that changes the dynamics of consumption. Obviously, this is about some kind of runny nose virus, and it will increase the rate at which toilet paper is consumed, because obviously, as the head wow, not Englishing very well today. as the headline says, you know, it's not just tissues that are being used here. It's impacting on toilet paper, and this is the lower impact of the two events that we have that have this kind of effect. But we should be able to see it happening here. Is that that is ticking down a lot faster than it was, and so what we can do to try and avoid shortage is we can make them go out for more toilet paper sooner. Whoa, we didn't manage to quite avoid that. So if there's stock already in transit that will get it up to 88%, then they won't be dispatched. You know, if there's 88% of stock already en route, or already, you know, allocated to being picked up, then we won't be dispatching vehicles, and that's kind of to make sure that we reduce the amount of wastage from you know, individual vehicles arriving with more than can stand, you know, more than there is room for, and it kind of reduces the amount of micromanagement that you need to compensate for that, which I think is positive, right? Like I think the very first pass we had on the simulation after we added the concept of vehicles in wasn't doing this, and it turned out that they were just because we didn't really have the sliders interactable. It just kind of, they were all set at 100%, I guess. It just turned out that they were constantly throwing out cars and gobbling up everything that was further up the supply chain immediately, and obviously that's not creating an interesting situation. This is one that you added fairly late in the game, or fairly late in development, that does sort of the opposite of what we've just seen, which is that it reduces consumption in a way that if you're already, let's say that you've just been responding to Sniffles and you've kept the resupply threshold up high and there's already a huge amount of stock, then you're potentially, going to be looking at generating wastage maybe. Certainly, it reduces the it takes time for it to cascade up, but it can sort of eventually affect how much is needed at the manufacturer level, or how much is needed to be produced because people aren't using it as fast.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for this too. So, I mean, intentions I don't actually think are quite as interesting as what people get out of it, but
well, I mean, we can speak to intention, but we can't really tell people what they're experiencing. So,
yeah, of course. What's kind of interesting is it's actually the Iron Bell thing came because of some of my experiences with Sniffles, and the first thing I was thinking. So again, sorry to kind of dodge a little bit about where you're going with this, but I promise you that this will return to Iron Bell and quickly. So with Sniffles, I really sat and wondered for a while about the whole idea of, like, when you look at those kinds of events, it's actually very hard to get that event at like a standard level of consumption and have it be like have it as a situation where you don't have I actually feel like we talked about this while it was going on too.
Yeah.
And there was a side of me that said, is like, okay, so is that a bad thing? Is that going to be something where, people are going to write emails in all capital letters to us about, why we're terrible people for not doing it that way? And in the end, like, that kind of comes back to the question of efficiency, which is like the efficiency one. I'm not going to say what the proper percent value is, because hopefully everybody's downloading the game right now and trying it for themselves.
and hopefully anything, there are like a couple of different valid combinations that you can arrive at for resolving that, whether that's having more buffer in your intermediary supply points, or whether that's tweaking the resupply rates at the ends. I hope. Sorry to derail you there.
Look at this, guys. It's the developer of this game, and he's still generating waste.
What? Zero waste? What are you talking about?
Oh, sorry. I had you on a smaller
yeah. I had some time empty, and some time unable to consume. So I did have people who were using pages out of books, I guess.
Well, no, I think time empty would be, or no, if unable to consume is the one that we're worried about.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, they were definitely using pages out of books. What book canonically? The official, yeah. Which book is getting
the Great Gatsby.
Shame on you.
Take that. This is the biggest pile of garbage. Yeah.
But yeah, so like,
I mean, it's not
I
garbage,
settled
obviously.
I settled on saying, like, okay, it is actually fine that what I thought was the equilibrium without events would almost certainly result in a loss or a unable to consume event if the Sniffles hit. And in the end, I was actually pretty fine with that, because, like, well, this is sort of the point, right? It's, just because it's happening at the home doesn't mean that it's part of a system that's susceptible to unexpected events. And so the idea where you've got these events that start adjusting your consumption up or down, then the amount at which you want to resupply things should be changing. And it sort of occurred to me, like, one of the things actually was, in a very practical sense, I felt like our value for resupply was starting to creep up, so that it would make sense to keep that thing riding high for a really long time. I was like, well, one way that you can do that in like a long run solution would be to introduce more events would be to introduce at least an event where the rate sort of slows down. If we had, let's say we had the sniff. I mean, the other thing that I did too is we had, we introduced the different severity between the two events. That helped out as well.
I think we had that in the beginning, and I made them the same accidentally while fixing a different bug.
Oh, I should pay closer attention. That's not fine without me ever noticing.
If I didn't bring attention to it, then it wouldn't be my fault.
Yeah, where we were, but yeah, like in the end, like what that thing did. I mean, it's silly. Like I'll admit, like I went for a silly headline because the idea of thing like toilet paper's kind of like spices and other goods like that. Like there's a really set amount. Like no matter how low you put the price of pepper, like you're not gonna see people like trampling over each other on a Boxing Day sale to get more pepper. Like, so it's weird to come up with events where like people are using less toilet paper.
There's been a national budget surplus, and instead of giving people like a tax rebate, we're just gonna ship them toilet paper. I think I suggested we went with Iron Bowels challenge because that's kind of fun commentary on some of these sort of social media driven challenges. I think another one that had floated as a suggestion that I didn't mind was the idea of a cheese festival.
Oh yes. Yeah, actually, I was gonna say I'm rather sad that the cheese festival didn't wind up in there, but I think that was ultimately because Iron Bowel was just too good not to include. Yeah. So.
Yeah, if we were making a bigger game with more events, I think we'd have a little bit more in the way of smarts about how the events are handled, and then adding more variation for similar types of events wouldn't be such a bad thing. Which is something I went through with Hive Time as well. Like originally it was just a straight list where everything was picked randomly, and then eventually I was like, okay, well I want these types of events to be occurring more frequently, and I want to make sure that these ones don't ever appear unless specific situations happen or something. So the Hive Time events list is broken down into 3 separate lists to manage that. But yeah, so we've kind of gone through. We've seen a bunch of events. We've seen me be vaguely competent at playing a game that I've made, which is probably less interesting than sort of stumbling around and going, oh, what is excuse me, what is any of this? What do these sliders mean? What happens if I do this? Which I hope that people will kind of explore and experiment with this idea of what happens if things are like I've just made, where 2 of the supply points are at 100 and the rest are at 0. Like, what does that mean? Well, here's the squirts epidemic. This is the one that has a really big impact and makes the toilet paper get used real fast, and that's kind of fun. But yeah, so if you're into this kind of thing, feel free to explore and experiment what the impact of different non-ideal configurations are, because that the limit of what you can explore with this kind of thing is not just what works best. It is what is the possibility space that all of this stuff exists within, and that's kind of interesting. But yeah, so unless there's anything else that you specifically wanted to show about normal gameplay, we haven't seen very many crashes. There was one earlier. We end up with some wastage on the road. That's kind of fun. But yeah, unless there's anything else that you wanted to show about normal gameplay, I'll switch across and we'll pull back the curtain a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything on normal. I mean, this is the big challenge that I think I sort of have with the game to a very limited extent, is that you are a little bit beholden to whatever RNG throws up to you. So if you get like 3 earthquakes in a row, you're going to think, they didn't put a lot of effort into this thing. It's like, no, you just got really unlucky.
So what I do in Hive Time is I keep a list, and then I shuffle that list, and I work through from the beginning to the end, and then I shuffle the list again, and then work through from the beginning to the end, and in that way avoid having a lot of repetition. But for the tiny event pool that we had for this game, I kind of feel like it's there is something interesting about having a whole bunch of earthquakes at once. Like, that prompts you to react. It provides something that you have to react to differently to if it's, if you get a whole bunch of vehicle crashes in a row, So I kind of felt like that was an okay direction to allow things to go in. I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel like it's kind of working well enough, and I just scared all the birds that were eating the bird feeder. Oops. But yeah, so I mentioned before we started streaming that I'd completely forgotten to put an image in the game. So I'm going to bring up the in-game event editor, which is, hang on, if we go into the settings menu and enable debug shortcuts, then the in-game event editor will work. And the, I think it was a counterfeit ring? No, it was energy drinks, right? It's a manufacturer one.
Yeah.
Which is productivity increase. I think it's high production. Hey, it is. Alright, so we can do a preview there, and here's an image that that I made last minute and then completely forgot to include in the game. Which is not anything particularly amazing, but because I made all of these made all the assets in 3D for these like backgrounds, I had the ability to just go, okay, well, I'll just move the camera to a different place and change some things, and suddenly we've got newspaper images. So a lot of these newspaper images kind of were very easy to come up with. So since I'm running a debug version of the game inside the Godot editor, when I hit save here, it's going to save into the game's code base. If I was running a release build, it would save the modifications, it would save these changes into the player's home folder, into a place that is loaded with sort of higher priority than the game's data files. So if you want to, effectively, this is a tool for modding and changing how things work. If you want to change some values, or you want to update some things, or change a description, or even make a new one, you can do that and then play the game with those changes, which is fun and interesting if you're into, again, exploring more of what you can you can get with this stuff. So there was there anything else that I was going to look at with the event editor in terms of there's not really any kind of good documentation about what any of these things mean. I could probably change that and add some tooltips or something into these, but for the moment there isn't anything that kind of tells you about how things work.
I think you wanted to check it was for events that had sorry, I'm trying to think the right way to put it, but like ones where the stock levels were adjusted and it wasn't clear. I seem to remember there was something you wanted to check.
Oh, like where the max capacity is decreased?
Yeah.
Yeah. So initially I didn't have these next and previous buttons, and there was something that I wanted to check. I think I wanted to check that they all had durations, or all the things that need durations had durations. And so I added these buttons in, and suddenly it's a lot easier to just go, oh yeah, does everything have an image? Does everything have like a time? Does everything have a valid supply point name? All that kind of stuff. So yeah, in terms of max stock level offset, this is like a warehouse collapse. It talks about things being damaged, so I think that kind of makes sense. What else? Max demand offset. This is public hygiene, reduces public facility usage. This is min demand offset, so that's like the threshold rather than stock level. Demand offset. Opportunistic capitalist. So this one is... Oh, and this shows the string substitution stuff that we're doing. So if you type supply point in braces like that, that'll get replaced with the name of the supply point that it's affecting, which is kind of fun. Yeah, this one decreases the maximum stock level by a significant amount, but I'm not sure if the description hints at that. I'm not sure that sitting here watching me go while I think about a way to word that is going to be interesting. So I'm just going to jot that down in my notes and make note of that to deal with later after the stream where it's less boring. But yeah, I'm really happy that that I was able to stick a little. I mean, this is really rough. It looks like garbage. Like, we go back to that one that we were just looking at, and there's like a scroll bar here rather than having the text wrap nicely, and there's like vertical scroll bars that do nothing. So it's kind of very rough. But in terms of being able to, the main reason I wrote this was so that we could make changes and immediately preview them before saving them. Otherwise, we'd need to like edit the code or edit the file that these are defined in, and then play the game, and then have some kind of shortcut set up to immediately launch these. In fact, at the time that I made that editor, I didn't think we had the ability to trigger a specific event anyway. So yeah. I'm glad that I put this in. The thing that I'm most happy about is that for anybody who is into this and wants to mess around and create their own content, that they can. But I think that like as a development tool, it was fairly valuable for the kind of stuff that we were doing across development as we were making all these. So definitely beneficial along a couple of axes. And I just kicked my webcam. Let me see if I can fix that up. Maybe. Yeah, close enough. Yeah, and I think I don't think you wrote any events before we had the editor, if I remember right.
No, yeah, I mean, this was one of the ones where I was a little surprised by the limitation brought on by the transit vehicles, because that was one of the things that I'd done on paper quite a bit, because it was one of these things, like, it's a little bit like debugging. I sometimes like saving debugging for a day I'm not feeling like God's gift to programming, because that is a very like straightforward and like I am getting work done and eventually I'll build some momentum. And I'm like, events, these are easy. I can usually come up with a sufficiently silly or practical real world example. And then, like, obviously I left that quite late in the process, and then I realized, oh wait, but we can't add too many because we're stuck on the vehicles. It's like, oh, kind of had this big checklist of things that I looked at, and I was like, all right, well, that's too bad. But yeah, you're right. Like, in terms of events, I really only added them quite late. I think probably in the last week or so, if I remember.
Yeah, I think that's right. I did like 2 or 3 placeholder ones right at the beginning, and when it was defined in the actual GDScript code base, and then after we externalized them, I think I wrote a couple more, and then when I wrote the editor, I put a bunch more in as well. But it was always like different levels of temporariness, and sort of the minimums needed to make sure that things were working as they would work. Once we had a chance to sit down and write some proper ones. And yeah, I think there might be 1 or 2 that haven't really changed from the beginning. I have some vague memory of I think Squirt, Sniffles, and Work from Home were sort of very early ones that were in there that didn't really change much. But I wanted to talk just a touch more about the event editor and how it works, because the UI for it is all dynamically generated. And we're going to switch back to Godot here. This game is also available under an MIT license, with all the source code sitting up on GitLab. If you want to poke around with this kind of stuff yourself, you're super welcome. So what I have here is a data structure. It is sort of vaguely based on experiences that I had working with a thing called JSON Schema, which was about using JSON to define data types and data relationships, such that you could build a database from them, or parse data based on that information. And so this idea of kind of declare and define all of your different things that you care about, give it some metadata that says what's going on. So here we have an internal name that is of type string and has a default that's empty. If we go back to the game and we make a new one, that's why this field is here. There's also supply point, which is required, and time is required. And so those three are the three fields that show up by default. Type real is a float. Type string is just text. And we can see that this one has a default of generic. So if we go back here and we're making our new one, generic is the supply point. And default value for time is 0, so that gets populated like that. And yeah, just like that's all that happens here. Everything that's not required shows up in this drop down list, so that we can add a property and do that. It also generates a close button, and it stores all of that in an internal dictionary, which is more or less like a JSON structure in terms of how it would be defined if you wrote it in code. And we can easily write that dictionary out to a JSON file, which is what we do in the end. But yeah, so there's like a function, and this is the function that this will call if the event triggers and it happens to have this particular property, and then that way we kind of entirely decouple the UI from the game itself and the code that it needs to call. I can put garbage in here, and it'll still generate the UI, and it will still everything will run right up until the point that there is no garbage function. But this allows me to do mapping between those things in a way that's a lot more flexible. Kind of tempted to externalize this and like just put this stuff in a JSON file that anybody could edit, but I'm kind of wary about the security implications of allowing people to just call functions, or define what function they're going to call. I mean, I guess a lot of people could just write their own applications to do weird or malicious things, but if it comes down to anybody like sharing content for a game that I made and that ends up making my game, weaponizing a game that I made, then I'm less cool and less comfortable with that. But the nice thing about all of this is, of course, that if we wanted to add a new parameter for an event, we could just type something out, and that'll show up immediately in the thing. Gotta actually write it correctly. Or in bool rather than that. So I had to write some code that would read all of this, and then depending upon what the type was, generate a label in a text box, or generate a checkbox, or generate whatever's needed. So there was a little bit of sort of work in getting that set up, but it's not really big. If we go into the event editor script, which is here, we'll see that code's pretty small. Where is it? Here. So I got a function that says, works out what the type is, and then calls a function that generates that particular type of widget, which is something like this. We got the bool widget, and makes a new. It probably doesn't even need to make that HBox container. That's superfluous. But I like to use a HBox container so that I can have a label next to a text box, or a label next to a whatever other type of data entry thing there is. But in this case, we just make a checkbox, we give it some text, we set its default value based on the default value that was defined in the code that we were just looking at. We set up some signal connections so that it will call a function to actually manipulate that value in the dictionary that temporarily stores the event, and then just adds it, and adds a remove button if it's removable. And so yeah, there's a different one of these functions for each of the different types of things, and then a couple of just sort of effectively setter functions for changing those values when you interact with those GUI widgets. And so the nice thing about having a temporary dict that contains the event is that doing a preview of it without having to save it out to either file or the game's running state is possible. So yeah, I can I found that was nice and flexible, and then we just do some validation stuff before we save. That's something else that can be defined in here. So if we have supply point, was it? Yeah. So there's a validate function which check SP name just checks to make sure that the whatever is typed in there matches the valid name of a supply point. So yeah, that was a fun little thing. I think I spent an afternoon on it. Like I said, it doesn't look very nice, and I might add some stuff in here. So I could add a sort of a tooltip parameter which says this must be a supply point or something like that. And then over in the event editor, when we're generating the widgets, we could also just do there's a string widget. We would say if tooltip. Well, hang on, we'd have to pass it in as a parameter because we're not passing the entire thing in. But yeah, we'd like adding that as a tooltip would just be a matter of back here doing a widget dot set hint text. I think it's hint text, maybe. No. Is it tooltip? No, I don't know. It's something. But yeah, adding that would be pretty straightforward. And in fact, I've already done that over in. Let's undo all this because I don't actually want to make any changes, and I don't want this either. Go away. Over in the settings thing, I've done a similar type of thing for declaring each of the settings that you can do, and I have a description field here that determines what the tooltip text will be if you're. Oh, let's just run that again. Determines what the tooltip will be if you mouse over the thing. So that's nice and handy, and probably boring for anyone who doesn't care about programming stuff. But I found that useful and nice to have. Yeah, I said that we would dig into how the sort of art for the game was made and the sort of graphics for the game. So if we do this, actually start stocked because that looks better, right? I'm gonna make a new one. There we go. Twink. I'll pause that. And so now we can sort of see vaguely what these look like. You've already been staring at this, but I wanted to come back to it just briefly. Visually, this more or less looks exactly the same as the original concept mock-up that I did back in March, I think it was. It was March that I did this. And like I said, I wasn't really planning to make it. I was just, what would this kind of thing look like? How would I go about communicating? How each of the bits and pieces of the puzzle work? I did this in Inkscape because I like to use Inkscape for mocking up these kinds of things. Lets me modify stuff and manipulate things after I've placed them down in ways that I find helpful and less destructive than doing similar things in raster-based programs. The factory was the least defined thing, at least visually. I was like, oh yeah, I guess toilet paper goes onto a spool, and then we will stick it in a box. As when we picked this up as something that we were actually going to develop, I ended up watching some tours of toilet paper factories and videos of different toilet paper production hardware. And while the final graphic isn't necessarily accurately representative of what the process looks like, it does contain elements of what is involved. So the big spool of paper gets put onto small spools, and those small spools end up getting cut into rolls, and there's lots of conveyor belts involved. So yeah, having something that's sort of visually animated in an interesting way ended up being kind of a valuable thing that I was happy with. I also had some notes on possible events and things, and then when we actually decided to start developing, I was like, okay, well what are the data types that we're going to care about in terms of being able to interact with this? Obviously things have changed a little, but in my mind I was like, if I'm going to do this, I guess it makes sense to or something that I really liked from the beginning was this idea that the only thing that is coloured is the stock or something moving the stock. So the transit vehicles are coloured because they contain the stock. The boxes are coloured because they contain the stock. The loo rolls themselves are the stock. But this idea that the things that aren't the stock is what we care about, and the other things are just side things that aren't so important. Oh, there's a dove out there. Hello, dove. Yeah, and so when I came to actually look at doing this in Blender, I discovered that I could tell an object to not render itself and only render the shadows that it received or the ambient occlusion that it received, and that ended up creating basically the style that we see here, where these things are transparent. I could change this background color, and it would change the background color here as well, which is fun. It's kind of cool. I like that. I was tempted for a while to stick like a color picker in the settings, so you could change that, but it was not hugely important. But yeah, so as we made the game and went through, I think I made this background first, and then this one, and then this one, and then the factory the factory was a toilet for a long time, and so I felt the need to sort of sit down and say, well, what, after looking at all those videos, what does it look like? How do we communicate things? Excuse me. I like this idea of showing open boxes in some way, because that helps remind you that the boxes that you see in the warehouse contain the toilet paper. So the idea of sticking rolls on conveyor belts felt fun. The putting one or two big spools in felt important. This was sort of the intermediary step when I actually felt like I'd nailed what I needed to do. Yeah, let's switch across to Blender. Oh, this is the image that we just put into the game. So what I did to do this one was just, this is the same factory layout that we have here, and I just copied and pasted a bunch of empty boxes and put a camera down nice and low, so that we get this kind of cool perspective thing going on. And yeah, so I'm pretty happy with that. I did orthographic cameras for like this rather than like this. So there's a difference between orthographic means that there's no perspective. Everything is treated as though it's the same size regardless of how far away from the camera it is, which I think works well with the very vertical thing that we've got in the game itself. There is perspective in the warehouse here. That's the only one that's got perspective, and it kind of bugs me. But I think it still works, and I don't think it's too bad. But yeah, so there's pretty simple and straightforward. Let me just make that easier to orbit around. Yeah, pretty simple and straightforward conveyor belty stuff. I just made a little support for them to go on. Made a little thing. There is. I don't know where it is. There's like a stand thing. We'll see that in a minute when I look at other ones. Yeah. Well, it looks like System Chalk is looking at heading to bed at some point soon. I want to make sure that I remember to to say goodbye and thanks for coming before he does disappear. So yeah, thank you again for joining me. Thank you again for working on a thing with me. It's been fun.
No worries. I'm sorry to break your flow there. Just I know the time difference is something we've been resolving for the past little while. But I didn't want to. I find this stuff really interesting, but I also know that if I don't, every time I've pushed myself a little bit later than I need to, it's always been.
You pay for it.
I regret that. Yeah. But yes, thank you for having me on and bringing me along for the ride on this.
Yeah, no worries. No worries at all.
Right. See you, Chad, as well.
Yeah, so I made these kind of fairly low poly, fairly simple models. This is like a giant paper spool that you would roll into smaller spools, like when you roll them onto the cardboard. So these have typically have metal spindles on them, and that's how the paper that toilet paper is made for is shipped to the manufacturers. Yeah. And so the process of making like just a little individual toilet roll is something like this. Let me just pop that there. I'm going to add a cylinder. I don't think they have 32 sides. I think they're a little bit less than that. Uh-oh. My power just went off. That was fun. Am I still online? I'm going to guess that maybe that was small enough for the modem to not die. Just gonna check. Yep, looks like I'm good. Yeah, so where was I? Yeah, so we got a cylinder. I don't think I did 32. Let's say we did 24 sides. That feels a bit more, Let's just move that up there. And then let's move this off to another scene layer thing that doesn't have anything on it, so that we can just work on this. So yeah, we got our little cylinder here. I would grab the bottom, delete the bottom, delete the face, not the vertices. And looking at getting this onto the grid, I did not. Yeah, that's gonna be messed up. Let's just type in some numbers. Hey. Let's put that on a 4, let's put that on a -6, and make that -32. Alright, so now that's aligned to the grid, and that's a lot easier to work with. So yeah, I would delete the bottom, I would add a modifier that mirrors along the vertical axis. No, one of these axes. No. Oh yes, sorry, Z is correct. It just needs to go up a little. There we go. Alright, so that's too tall. So we can just bring that down. That's about toilet roll shape. It's kind of fun. Thank you for confirmation that the stream is still live. So I would delete that. And then I would use I for insert. No, I doesn't work like that. Okay, E for extrude, and escape to get rid of that. Scale that down till it's a good size, and then E to extrude that down. Let's just do that from this view, so that it goes there. Perfect. And then yeah, we more or less got our toilet. It's still very tall, right? So let's just eyeball that down to something like that. That feels more toilet rollish. And yeah, so that's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. If I go into sort of rendered mode here, can see it looks kind of flat and boring. So what I want to do to just give it a little bit more character is we'll grab both of the vertices along here, and we'll extrude that out to be like a piece of toilet paper hanging off. So now we can draw it like that, and it's a bit more interesting. And that's more or less how all of the toilet paper images were made. It's all pretty straightforward. So if we go back here, had a few scenes. So I'm upside down. That's fun. Had a few scenes that I made. This one has a just a light and a camera in it, and originally I was going to use that for everything. It's a toilet. It's again pretty low poly. It has a couple of details like the flush button, and the lid is actually separate as well. So I can just grab the lid and move that off, or rotate it up if I want. If I want to do that sort of thing. Obviously, if I was, I would align myself correctly to the scene so that it wasn't crooked. But yeah, so I can mess around with that and have a bit of fun. I think the next layer has the toilet paper that goes with that, so when you're at full stock it looks something like this. I think I ended up making the second row less tall and only allowing 3 to be stacked on the bog roll, or on the top of the cistern. Yeah, but again, this started life as a cube, and I just extruded things around. Most people possibly some people. I don't know. I feel like we have this much toilet paper in our house right now, but only 4 rolls are sitting next to the toilet, and 1 roll on the wall. The rest of them are still in their bag, sitting in a cupboard somewhere. So we didn't really want to represent people's storage cupboards. So just the idea of stacking it next to the toilet is fun. I like that. Obviously the shelves are just a couple of cubes, stretched and put next to each other. I want a little gap in the shelves so that the shadows would be interesting. So we've got a floor and a wall here somewhere. There we go. Yeah, not that one. This one. Yeah. Well, maybe it's difficult to see here, but in game, if we go back to the game, you can sort of see the light coming down through the little gaps there, and that's fun. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, everybody handles theirs different. So yeah, the toilet here is, if we go to rendered, is currently using a material called white, but I would change that to transparent floor, and suddenly it's still there, but it's kind of a ghost in an interesting way. And that's that kind of stylistic choice that I ended up making and really enjoying sticking with. It was fun. If we add the light in as well, we get some stuff going on there, and if we add these two, then we get the shadows, and obviously I turn the shadows down a bit from what's visible here. But that really helps the sort of transparent toilet pop. Yeah. Yeah, we stack ours next to the toilet, but we don't keep we keep more than what we stack next to the toilet in the house. And we usually only stack up to 5 or so rolls. Because, I mean, there have been times where I've stacked like a dozen rolls, because that's funny, and then Miriam walks into the toilet and goes, "What the hell is going on?" But yeah, it's not sort of been a normal thing. So after I did that, I felt the need to make a box for the warehouses. And the box actually has a lot more detail than it needs to have. Has a little dip here where the lid meets, and a little dip here in the side where it comes in. I put tape and some like marks on it and a barcode and stuff, just to give it a little bit of detail when we render it. Render it with some light and a floor, I guess. There we go. There's our box, looking cool. Does the box have a man in it? No, the box is empty. See, if we go into iframe, no mans. But yeah, in terms of how I did that, I just used lots of loop cuts. It's not very efficient, but since this is being rendered down to a 2D picture, who cares, right? Like, it's about how quickly you can make it rather than anything else, you know. I also did an open version of the box, which has like the lid as separate pieces, so just a matter of disconnecting that and then extruding the interior down in there. So you know, the box has an inside, and we actually ended up using the empty box for the factory. I wasn't planning to have one at all, so I did it again. Damn it! No. There we go. Hopefully that's looking in vaguely the right direction. I haven't scared all of the birds too much. Yeah, so this is just like one roll with a couple of array modifiers on it, to, you know, duplicate it along different axes. Let's put that back. Yoink. And that was really easy to make. And an empty box with no toilet paper. Here's the shelves that I ended up using. I put a camera here. This is not the camera that I used. But yeah, I ended up making a camera that sort of has this kind of perspective on it. And just in the interests of tuning it and making it work better, I ended up taking one side in GIMP and flipping it around, and that way I could easily control how close they were without messing with how much perspective I had. going on, and that was that made everything a little bit easier. But again, these are pretty simple models over here. It's just this little chunk repeated a bunch of times, so it's mirrored first, and then that mirrored thing is repeated that way, and also up. To get the shelves, the top I think is a separate object. Yeah, top's a separate bit. But everything else is just this little chunk here. Using array modifiers to get like copies of things to make shelves or streets or buildings or whatever you want. Super handy. And obviously these are the boxes that go in the shelves. Originally I was like, okay, well we'll just do 2 shelves and show 1, 2, 3, 4, 12, 24 boxes. But it turned out that with the kind of perspective that I ended up using, you couldn't really differentiate between the boxes. This looks like 1 box here. It's actually 3. So I sort of extended things along, and it's like 3 disappear when they get picked up. And you don't really get to see as much in the way of stuff, but it works well enough. I'm happy with it. And yeah, I did a bunch of renders with different amounts of toilet paper visible, and then exported those as separate images that get toggled on and off as the game does its thing. So what else do we have? We talked about the factory. That's more or less what goes on here. The caution striping that's in the game here, I just painted that in myself after the fact. I don't know what's here. These are the images that are used for when stock is picked up. So to help make it more readable when stock is picked up, there's like a little particle effect that shows stock moving up off the screen to where the vehicle must be. Yeah, I just sort of put those here and put them at a nice angle, and just rendered those out as little things. I don't know what's in this scene. Oh, that's the toilet paper I just made. And this is an example model I made for another developer. It doesn't really belong here at all. We were talking about how to make things using bevels to create make flat surfaces more interesting. How to do doorways that feel like they're more than just a hole in the wall. So there you go. But yeah, so since I'm not a very organized developer, my plan was, I'm going to keep everything in one blend file, and that's going to make everything very easy. This is like a mail. Mail. This is not a mail slot. This is meant to be like a handprint reader or something. This was for when Michael was working on Tachyon, and he was talking about his doors feeling flat. I was like, okay, here's how I would approach this kind of thing. Yeah, so originally I was like, okay, well I can put all my supply point images in here in one file, and obviously here's the stock that goes on there, and we've got the stock that goes on there, and I've got the toilet paper, and that's all well and good, and I did that, and that was great. But then I found myself doing those newspaper articles that we talked about, and I found myself going, okay, well, I did my original vehicles, and they didn't have wheels. They're just like a top view, right? I didn't have any reason to. That's what they look like in game. Obviously, they're a little bit smaller. I didn't have any reason to see the side, and then when we decided that we were going to do newspapers, I was like, oh no, well actually maybe I do. Maybe I do need wheels. What's going on? So now I have a lot more files that have. Where's this one? This one? Yeah. Okay. So added wheels, carved holes for the wheel arches, and tried to make things more interesting. There's a door here, but I was a tool bag and completely forgot that when I'd like, instead of making a duplicate of this, I just moved the original around, and that was irritating and frustrating. But well, so I think this the first image I did was this one, which is the transit strike thing. I just put a wide FOV on there and just had like a whole bunch of big array of vehicles stretching off into the distance, which kind of feels like fun. And then the second one I did was this one, the crash truck, and oh, okay. I hadn't saved it at this point. Okay, so we're gonna go to the next one. Second one was this one, crash truck with all these boxes and things spilled out there. That's the image as it comes out in the end. Looks something like that, which is really cool. That array of toilet paper that I had, I think I may have modified the location, which sort of broke the simulation, which means that it's not being like simulated properly anymore. But we'll see. Oh yeah, half of them go back to where they're meant to be. I did just a physics simulation that allowed them to tumble out of the box and find interesting places to land on their own, and I sort of squidged it around until I felt like it was interesting. The way that collision works is that things don't quite meet the floor, so we end up with a situation where a lot of these look like they're hovering, and moving them down ended up breaking the physics simulation because they're no longer attached to their original position, which is why only half of them go back into the box like that. So that's kind of fun, and I felt like using a physics simulation for all these kinds of things. Same here with the little car. Has had a physics sim to place all these, and then deleted the ones I didn't want and shuffled around the ones that I was happy with. I didn't think there was anything else sort of interesting going on in this file. Not really. But yeah, there's like a whole bunch of, because these were all destructive changes that I was making to things. This is supply point. This is vehicles 3. Oh no, that was the car. Car was vehicles 3. We're up to vehicles 4. Roadworks looks like this was the start of the Roadworks one, maybe. Oh no, this was the other truck that I did, which I just kind of same thing again. These guys are physics objects. These boxes, they all sort of slid out and found their own positions in interesting ways. Maybe we can go back and see all that. Boonk. Yeah, some of them are. Oh, that's interesting. It just immediately shifts them there I guess because I moved them and something didn't work. I don't know. But in terms of finding the original thing that worked nicely. Oh, and sort of I put extra wheels on this truck because to help differentiate it from the other truck. Find the sort of locking mechanism on the door helps give the back a lot more interesting characteristics. But yeah, this is like a fun little jackknifed type situation for the vehicle there, and then in 5, gonna remember which ones I'm on eventually. 5 was the one that I used for speed limit changes and roadworks and stuff. Kind of like, I feel like the roadworks one came out okay. Did these witches hats here, which have a white band on them, which breaks that whole like the toilet paper should be the only thing that's coloured. But oh well, whatever. It is what it is. So I did a few different things. I'm not super happy. I think the speed limit ones are the ones I like the least. Made a little laptopy thing. Has some USB ports on the side, and I think a CD port over here. Yeah, look at that, nice. Little camera up top. Just for doing like this. This also breaks the rule because this ends up being coloured. Otherwise, it's two transparent things sitting on each other, and that's less interesting. And obviously, I did the same thing for the supply points. When we come back to here, is this the one where I did? I don't know what this one is. This one has shelves are in slightly different locations. Maybe I did some. I don't know. I kind of remembered to save as different files halfway through doing stuff, so a lot of them have things in there that aren't needed. One of them's gonna have something interesting in them, I reckon. Oh, hey, this is the one. This is the one that I recorded. Okay, so these ones are actually me working through all the different things, and this is gonna have, yeah, this was the factory as it got done. And then yeah, for some of the others, I did like closed shelves. This sort of meant to have like caution tape or something across it. Yeah, ends up looking like that in the event, which is cool. What else we got here? This one looks like it's got a lot more things. Oh yeah, it's the smashed shelves. Looking cool. I manually broke this up. I applied all of those array modifiers I was talking about earlier, and then went in here and selected a few faces and moved a few bits around. Rotate this bit and stick it down here and make it look like it's kind of busted and attached to something still, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, I did that. Did a little physics sim for these boxes as well. And crunched up a couple of the boxes for fun. But yeah, did all this sort of stuff because it was destructive. I wanted to stick it in different files, and that is now made. Now made. If I ever want to release this stuff, it's gonna be harder. So this one's Sniffles, which means that either. Hey, there it is. There's the toilet paper. Scrunched up after being used as nose blowing stuff. Yeah. Squirts was a little bit different. I ended up using a physics sim for this as well. So you can see that there's bits of toilet paper there. If I go back here, we can see that those are actually just like flat sheets. If I edit one of them, we'll see that they're actually fairly high poly things. I don't know why there's like weird triangulation, inconsistent triangulation. I don't think it matters. I don't care. So I never bothered to do anything about it. But if I play that animation, they all just kind of fall, droop nicely over the edge of the toilet there. And that saved me a hell of a lot of work, Just make a couple planes, put physics on them, done. I ended up modeling shifting things around on the inside of the toilet, so there's a bigger gap at the back so that the lid can sit at an angle without overcoming things, and there's actually like a little lip in here now that there wasn't before, which kind of helps make things look a bit nicer for the rendered image. But yeah, physics sim definitely sped things up here. This was the first one that I did any kind of physics sim on for this, so I'm pretty happy with how it came out. And after that point, I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to use physics sims, I may as well go nuts. The last sort of 3D thing that I did was this, which I used as the background image for the cover image on itch, and I used it as the stream stuff. Just wanted to come up with something where I could render just a whole bunch of toilet paper. And this as well is done using physics. If we go right back to the beginning, we just got these big blocks of toilet paper. Each of these is like a little separate physics object, and I made a couple of pins to put them on. If I play it, they'll fall down, and go nuts. And now that that's cached, I can go to the camera view and we can watch it happen in real time. View. And so I just kind of stopped it about here, I think. Orbited around to find like the most interesting level of mix of foreground and background things that had like cool depth to it. Some of these ones that are right on the foreground don't have any detail on them, and they're kind of lit a little bit too white. And some of the ones that are in real deep are just like completely in shadow and not interesting. And then of course there's bits like this where like a bunch of things fell by in alignment without hitting any of these, hitting each other or hitting any of these rods that I put in. So yeah, I just sort of had to dig around to find the kind of thing that I wanted. And in the end I did, and I'm happy. I left a couple gaps in, like I was fine with gaps because I could just take the image and flip it behind, and fill those gaps in without it looking weird, which is exactly what I did here. Well done. Yeah, so that's like all the 3D work I did. A lot of it was just quick and dirty, and it was all about like what's the minimum I need to do to accomplish what I need to accomplish. There are a couple of other things I did here in this file. Obviously, the cover image went through a couple of iterations. At first, I was like, okay, well maybe we could do this kind of thing. I was like, no, let's spice it up and put a lot of toilet paper in there, and you know, focus on more the sort of stylistic thing of this very noisy ambient occlusion type thing, and do that instead, rather than the sort of stark color thing. And I ended up putting like a green drop shadow on the text that I think makes it more interesting. With the application icon here, this isn't a render. This is like an SVG that I made. Ooh, that's not what I wanted to do. I can, you know, these are separate objects that I can move around. Yeah, there we go. There's all the bits that make it up. You know, this little sheet here just sits over where the shadow goes, and yeah. Put for once I put the brown cardboard in the middle, and then I think Peter's going to release the soundtrack later, so we just did this for the soundtrack. But there you go. There's a tour of all the sort of asset creation stuff. I guess the last thing we'll look at is we'll just jump back over here. We'll go to the JSON folder, and just quickly talk about the data files for the events. So let me just reload that, and let me make this window bigger. Let me increase the font size so that people other than me can read it. No, you're gonna. There we go. All right. So this defines all of the none of this stuff is defined in the game. It's all defined externally in this file. So first supply point is called manufacturer. It has a maximum level of 100. That's 100 stock units can fit in there, and its initial demand starts at 85. Because that's a production slider, it's 85% of the production slider, but the slider goes from 1% to 200%, so it starts at like 170 or something. Warehouse has the transit size set. So transit size is the transit vehicles belong to the supply point to the right. So when it's a car, it belongs to home, and so the car size is 15. When it's a store, and that's the first sort of small truck that comes from the store to the warehouse and back, that's 30. And from the warehouse to the manufacturer, it can store 60 units. How much an actual unit is varies from supply point to supply point. And it's kind of meant to be, you know, one store supplies many homes, and one warehouse supplies many stores. So I feel like there's an implied reduction of scale across the whole thing, and obviously, you know, the actual units that are used by the simulation don't reflect that. So we don't really expose them anywhere. But yeah, so it's like a bunch of things that we can set in here, and all this gets parsed. You know, if I wanted to change this to Jeff, then we'll come back here, and it may not run. I don't know. Let's find out. I think it might break because there are a couple of. Nope, Jeff is a toilet. There we go. So the toilet's what it uses. That was the thing I wasn't sure on, because I knew that these visual indicators were determined by the name of the thing, but it defaults to a toilet. So Jeff is a toilet. It's fun. Produce them toilet papers, Jeff. And then you can turn that up, and then it turns up the production rate. And they have this idea of like, maybe it loops around, whatever's flushed here ends up coming in here, and then then gets passed all the way back through the chain. That's fun. So yeah, there's a bunch of these files that we've got in here. We've got timings, which I'll crank up again. Doink. And this determines how long it takes for the events to appear and how long it takes for the reports to appear. So if you want to have those faster, you know, the amount of effort involved in tweaking that is pretty small. And newspapers.json is just the random newspaper names. There are some of these are based on Canadian newspapers. Some of these are based on Tasmanian newspapers. And you know, we could have gone nuts and made a lot of these, but yeah. There wasn't really a huge amount of need to externalize this, but it's kind of fun to externalize all the content and say, you know, if you want to manipulate these, just go and edit it in the text file. You don't need to recompile the game or rerun the game. Well, you do need to rerun it so it gets reloaded, but yeah, you don't need to like modify the game itself, and that's kind of fun and cool. And then the events file, because it's written by the is it JSON.toString or something? I don't know. Let's go find it. I wrote a function called writeJSON, and it does. It's a function called toJSON, and that doesn't put carriage returns or new lines in at all. So it all ends up being just this big soup. But this defines all of those things that we were talking, or this is a copy of all of those different fields that we were talking about before, back up here. So this time and headline and subheading and image and stuff, and they all end up in this file when we save it. So there's image and headline, and time is down here as well. Supply point, and this particular one skips supply points that are producing. You notice that whether or not they were producing is not defined here. When we actually set up the we load all that stuff and set them up. Based on that, we set up the downstreams. Where is it? I thought yeah, here in downstream. So after we've set up, so we instantiate all of those things, and then we run through that list and say, okay, let's give each of you a reference to the next supply point up the chain and the next supply point down the chain, because that makes navigating between them a lot easier. After we've done that and gone and set all the downstreams, or the downstream references, which also sets the upstream references for us, we set the first one in the list to be producing and the last one in the list to be consuming. So that's fun. Excuse me. So yeah, not having to having that happen automatically means that we could even rip out one of these and run the simulation, and it will still work. If we send a truck, it'll go and get stuff from here, and it will put it here. And everything will still happen. We can have as many as we want. There's no scroll bar, so that would be not great for us. But yeah, so the ability to modify the game is more than just like changing these initial values. We're actually changing how everything is set up, and that's fun. And yeah, the only other JSON file I got hiding in here is the credits, which is not particularly interesting. I just like have a key, and that's the heading, and then the values in an array. The values are an array, and the entries in those arrays are the names. And yeah, it's just, this is exactly how I did the credits in Hive Time, and to an extent Honeycomb Crunch. I think I did a similar thing. So there's one last thing that we're going to touch on, and that is how the sort of mod support works. I mentioned before that when you save in the event editor, it will, if it's running in a debug build, it'll save to like wherever the data folder is. But if it's running in a release build, it's going to save somewhere else. So if I go to that location, which is where there's logs and configs and stuff, I will open up a new thing here. Don't mind me, just messing around. I'm just going to grab a build, and I'm going to run a standalone build, which is here. And so we'll see this is the sort of user folder. In fact, if I went into the settings menu and clicked open user folder, that would open this folder. But we don't need to do that. I can turn on the event editor, and I'm going to make a new event called Jeff. I'm going to add a headline and a subtitle, and we're going to give it a time of 20, and it's going to, I don't know, adjust the stock level by -50 or something. Alright, we'll save that, and what that has done is it's created a folder called JSON, and in there is an events file, and it is an entire copy of the event list that was in the game. And now if we run the game again, and then bring up the editor, and we'll see that our Jeffrey event is in there, and it does the thing. Now we can preview it from here as well, as I mentioned before. There's no image, so we can define an image, and we'll use the template one, which is that. We can even activate it and see those effects actually happen, so it just pulled 50 stock out of here, and that's all gone now. But yeah, so the ability to, you can override any of the JSON files from that are bundled with the game by sticking them in a JSON folder in your user folder in here. And how I do that is all the paths that I pass into this read JSON file, if we zip up here, they don't have a prefix. So normally if you want to access something from the game's data files, you do a res :// which means it's in the resource bundle. If I don't do that, and then down here in our read JSON file function, I have a prefix that I set to res, and then if the file that we're asking for, which is what path is, if that exists in the user folder, then we will set the prefix to user and use that instead of the one that's bundled with the game. And that's all it is a case of, if it exists, use that instead. And then when it comes to save, we check to see if it's a debug build, and if it's a debug build, then we save into the folder where the game data is. Otherwise, we just save into the user folder. And that's kind of cool. It's kind of fun. Yeah, I'm like, I haven't really done anything that has sort of explicit mod support. You can actually do this same stuff in Hive Time. Hive Time has the same thing where it'll read from the user folder if anything exists. And with shipping versions of the game, I've actually included, so you got the fonts as separate files in case you want to mess with the fonts. Because they're under a separate license, I like the idea of allowing those to be accessed separately. And also there's a JSON folder. This folder is ignored by the game. It's basically a template that you could then copy into your user folder if you wanted to make your own changes. So it's the idea there, is that you can do that if you want. And that way, when I ship a new build, it can overwrite this safely because it's a template. It's not like any kind of like actual customized game data, but it's always there as a resource for people to use if they want. And it's fun, and I'm really happy with that. And I think that covers just about everything that I wanted to look at. Yeah. Oh, and the credits, you can like click and drag on them if you want to stop them at any point. You just click and hold. If you want to like zip down to a specific part, very easy to do. I'm really happy with how that came out. That was like a last-minute change to hive time, and keeping it here is quite nice. You don't have to click a mouse button. You can also hold space if you want and move the mouse around. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope that's been interesting. It's been a little bit of fun to dig in and talk about the game and what it what it means to the people who made it, and also just give an overview of some of the work behind it. If you're interested in checking it out, you can find Supply Chain on itch, and you can find the source code for it on GitLab. Excuse me. Yeah, that's about all I got to talk about. So I will leave you there. Thank you again for joining me, and have a great day. Goodbye.